Terry Hansen holds degrees in biology and science journalism from the University of Minnesota and has worked as a magazine editor, journalist, and technical writer. His interest in UFOs arose from curiosity about the origin of life and potential evidence for non-terrestrial intelligence. Over the years, he has written about the UFO controversy for various media, including the Minneapolis Star and Tribune and National Public Radio. He is author of The Missing Times, News Media Complicity in the UFO Cover-Up. Please help welcome Mr. Terry Hansen.
When I say that the federal government and the news organizations are working with each other, a lot of people are surprised at that. In fact, even a lot of journalists are surprised. And so I want to start out by talking about why news organizations cooperate with the federal government. And also, next I want to talk about the history of news censorship and how that's achieved in practice. And then how propaganda works to hide important events and reduce public curiosity. Fourth, I want to talk about potential ways to circumvent UFO-related media deceptions, and offer a few thoughts about national security, and then finally talk a little bit about the prospects for achieving a more open, accountable federal government, which I think is what we all dearly need right now. So why do news organizations cooperate with the federal government if indeed that's true? I think to understand this, you have to understand the relationship between the big media companies and the federal government historically going back about 100 years. Now, prior to World War II, the federal government in the United States was relatively weak and disorganized compared to what it's like today. And there was quite a good deal more independence between the media and the government. But this changed rather dramatically in World War II because the British government was locked in a struggle with Germany in World War I, and they needed to bring the Americans in on their side of the war. The British were very expert in the use of censorship and propaganda and controlling the media because they had been running a global empire for quite a long time. And they really knew all the tricks about propaganda. So what they did was they aimed their propaganda machinery toward the United States in order to change American public opinion from being anti-war to being pro-war. And they enlisted the help of President Wilson. And Wilson, in turn, looked to leading journalists of the day, the so-called progressive journalists, such as George Creel and other big names. They were like, Walter Cronkite or someone of that caliber at the time. And Wilson asked Creel to take over the government effort to manage censorship and propaganda for the U.S. And the organization was called the Committee on Public Information. Now, Creel, in turn, looked to his colleagues in the news business to help him operate the censorship and propaganda apparatus. So this really was the first time when the news media and the federal government began coming together in a major organized fashion, and it was to bring the American public opinion around to supporting World War I. Now, this really gathered a great deal more steam in World War II. As you're probably aware, Pearl Harbor was a catalyzing event that brought America into the war. There had been a pretty strong anti-war movement prior to that, headed by Charles Lindbergh and other well-known figures who didn't want us to get into the World War. And to overcome this, it was necessary to again draft the news media into the business of changing public opinion. But at this time, the propaganda and censorship tasks were so big and sophisticated that it could no longer be done by a single organization. So there were two organizations set up. One was called the Office of Censorship that administered control over the news in the United States, and then the Office of War Information, which administered war propaganda. And this was all designed, again, to keep the public behind the war effort. Now, these huge bureaucracies that were created during World War II were staffed by leading media executives of the time and well-known journalists. And they were really the ones who were called upon to censor the news and to create propaganda to keep the public in a warlike frame of mind. So, as I say, this really consolidated the relationship. At this point, there really wasn't very much difference between the big media companies and the Pentagon, or the military, I should say. The Pentagon didn't exist at that time. So that, you know, this sort of Chinese wall that everyone thinks exists between the media and the government really broke down altogether. Now, after World War II, this relationship really continued, and the news media kind of came to accept or believe that the United States government faced this permanent hostile threat. The nature of that threat has changed over time, but it's sort of fundamental to the way the U.S. news media look at the world even today. Now it's terrorism, it was communism, it's been various things over the years. And the role of censorship and propaganda shifted from the two organizations that I talked about earlier to the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, many people think that the CIA was created to gather intelligence, but the CIA actually had a much broader charter than that, and one of their most important tasks was creating and disseminating propaganda and censoring the news. And the CIA, under a gentleman named Frank Wisner, created a very sophisticated global apparatus that employed all of the leading news organizations in the world, just about, including very well-known organizations like CBS and New York Times and so forth. I think it's important to go back a little bit and think about why the CIA was created, especially in the context of this discussion about UFOs, because we were told that the CIA was created to prevent any further Pearl Harbors. And the assumption that that's based on is that Pearl Harbor was actually a surprise attack. But there's a lot of evidence available now. There's a book by a gentleman named Robert Stinnett called Day of Deceit. And Stinnett argues very persuasively, based on documents and interviews with code breakers and people of that nature, that FDR really kind of maneuvered the Japanese into attacking the United States, and knew, because we were breaking the Japanese codes, that the Japanese were going to attack, and they just kind of stood back and let it happen, because they needed a rationale to overcome the anti-war organizations that existed in the U.S. So if this is true, and not everyone agrees that it is, but if it's true, then the public rationale for creating the CIA was false. There was another reason for creating the CIA. So I just want to throw that idea out there. Now, of course, we're all familiar with more recent history here, the rather embarrassingly inept behavior of the U.S. news media prior to the Iraq War, and the fact that reporters covering the war joined the military forces and sacrificing any possibility of remote or of impartial reporting. And really kind of aiding and abetting this idea that 9/11 was the rationale for attacking Iraq, which a lot of Americans still accept, despite a lack of evidence for it. And of course, the media never mentioned oil in the whole context of the Iraq invasion, despite obvious ties by many White House staffers to the oil industry. Now, the relationship between the CIA and the American news media was exposed in the 1970s, and it was subject to a fair amount of coverage, originally in the Columbia Journalism Review and then in more popular publications such as Rolling Stone. This is a famous article by Carl Bernstein of Watergate fame, in which he talks about why the big media companies were in league with the CIA. This is an obituary for Sig Mickelson that appeared in the New York Times in the year 2000. And he's quoted in here as saying, I didn't raise an eyebrow about cooperating with the CIA back then. It was just a very casual relationship that the news agencies had with the intelligence apparatus, and they were very accustomed to censoring news and blocking stories and doing things of this nature. Now, of course, we're always led to believe that this was done because of the Cold War, but as we all know, there was much more going on than the Cold War. There was the whole UFO controversy playing out, and so it raises a question of whether these favors that the news media were doing extended into the realm of UFOs. Here's an article from the New York Times also from March 24th, 2001, and it says basically that during the Cuban Missile, or the Cuban Bay of Pigs period, the CIA had the ability to use the AP and UPI wire services to distribute propaganda stories worldwide. So here again, this is very clear evidence that in the mid-60s anyway, the news services were in league with the intelligence apparatus and were making their services available to the CIA for whatever purposes they had. Have things changed any? Well, I don't think so, unfortunately. There's sort of the... I think we may have lost our... Oh, there we go. We're back on. It's often asserted that once these relationships were exposed in the 1970s that the news media and the CIA stopped doing this, but I don't think that's really the case. If you go onto the website for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and also National Public Radio, you'll see that a lot of the high executives within those organizations spent most of their careers working for the U.S. government in propaganda operations such as Radio Marti and Radio Liberty and various things like that. This is another example from National Public Radio's website. Kevin Close, who I think is still the CEO of NPR. Again, you can read it on their website, but he spent pretty much all of his career as a professional propagandist, and now he's in charge of NPR. Not a very comforting development. Now, not only does the government look to the media to condition public opinion about many things, but the government does favors for the big media. I have here a slide which shows the number of corporations that control the U.S. news media over time from about 1983 to 2004, and it drops from about 50 companies, 50 corporations controlling the media to about 4 or 5 in 2004. I think it's even less now. So this has all been facilitated by our own elected representatives who have helped the news media coalesce into just a few small organizations. So that makes it that much more easy to control the type of information that Americans receive about world events. So if you wonder why UFO stories and other significant events don't seem to get a lot of coverage, well, there's some reason there's a reason to understand that. Now, I want to talk about censorship because a lot of people don't understand how that works, and it's really a very sophisticated process and very well developed. I want to emphasize that when a government is trying to deceive people about world events, whether it's the war in Iraq or UFOs or whatever, they always follow a two-step process. And the first step is censorship, and that closes off public awareness of real-world events. And I quote Walter Lippmann here, who was a well-known journalist and public opinion expert, and he said, "Without some form of censorship, propaganda in the strict sense of the word is impossible. In order to conduct a propaganda, there must be some barrier between the public and the event. Access to the real environment must be limited before anyone can create a pseudo-environment that he thinks is wise or desirable." So that's the first step, censorship, and then that's followed by propaganda, which is intended to create a carefully manufactured false reality in place of what's actually happening. And I quote Edward L. Bernays, who is a very influential public opinion expert. He says, "Propaganda is the executive arm of the invisible government." So this is a very well worked out scheme. So let's get back and talk a little bit about how propaganda works. There are a lot of methods for keeping information under wraps, and one, probably the best well-known, is military censorship, or sometimes referred to as censorship at source. The Pentagon is a very well-financed, very influential organization, and they're capable of suppressing information on a grand scale and do so. Now, another technique is discreet or behind-the-scenes contacts with publishers and media owners. This is also a very common way of squelching a story. The CIA director can call up the publisher of the New York Times or someone at CBS News and explain to them why the government simply doesn't want the public to hear about a certain event, and there are many documented examples of them agreeing to squelch a story. Many influential journalists are recruited by the intelligence community covertly and are working as high-profile journalists, but in fact have a relationship with the intelligence community off the records. Another method is to monitor and intercept news reports. I talked a bit about the wire services before. I'll talk a little bit about that later on. There's lifetime secrecy agreements. This is something that applies to a lot of people that work in government who are dealing with classified materials. They basically sign away their constitutional rights in exchange for a job working in a secret area. There's surveillance of organizations, theft and confiscation of evidence. We've seen some of that in the history of the UFO field. Character assassination. I think a lot of people who've been active in this area have run into that. Threats against individuals and organizations, harassment, and in some cases incarceration of dangerous or uncooperative people. There have always been rumors that people have been assassinated to keep certain UFO secrets undercover. I don't know if that's true, but I've heard that claim made. So let's talk about censorship in World War II to kind of understand how this apparatus all came together. The naval intelligence was really extremely influential in censorship in World War II, and that started in about 1935. They were given the task of censoring cable, radio, and overseas telephone circuits, and military intelligence was assigned censorship of mail and telegraph lines. When the war was more on the horizon, 1940, December 1940, Navy Secretary Frank Knox asked the media to start holding all unauthorized Navy news. So again, you can see that censorship was beginning to set in there a full year before the Pearl Harbor attacks. The Navy knew that something was up, and they were getting ready for it. December 7th, 1941, a lot of people aren't aware of this, but a lot of the news coming out of Pearl Harbor was censored because the government felt that it was too shocking to give the public all the details about what happened. And shortly after Pearl Harbor, I think within about 48 hours, Byron Price, who is executive editor of Associated Press, was sworn in as director of censorship. And he was given the task of censoring mail, cable, wireless, radio, telephone, and so on. Again, I think it's important to emphasize that the executive editor of one of the most influential wire services was being placed in charge of censoring the news. And then Price went on to hire John Sorrells, who was executive editor of Scripps Howard News Agency, and they owned United Press International, another major wire service at the time. So right away, you can see the government was torquing down on those two channels of information there, the wire services. Now, let's get back to the subject of UFOs here. This is an item from Newsweek, December 25th, 1944, called the Silver Sphere Puzzle. And they're saying here that they were citing, our pilots were citing anomalous silver-colored spheres. They came to be known as Foo Fighters, and that the reports of these were being heavily censored by Supreme Allied Headquarters. I think it's important to realize that during World War II, the U.S. did not have a free press for the reasons I've just explained. So we don't really know a lot about what was happening with UFOs during the World War II period because all the news was subject to very careful censorship. It's my personal opinion that there was probably much more going on prior to the Kenneth Arnold sighting and some of the high-profile reports of the late 1940s, but these never came to light during the war years because of the very heavy military censorship that was in place. After the war ended, things loosened up a bit, and we began to see and learn about things that were going on, but then the CIA came in and started torquing down again on that. There were a lot of significant laws passed in the wake of World War II, which really made our society much less open. One was the Atomic Energy Act, 1946. And that declared that a lot of scientific knowledge would be instantly classified. In other words, it would never see the light of day outside of the small group of people doing the research. The National Security Act was created 1947, signed into law, a very controversial law at the time that created the CIA. This again was in the midst of the UFO phenomenon heating up in the media. There's something called the UK-USA Treaty, or the Secret Treaty. It created kind of a global intelligence network among all the major English-speaking countries. And then there was something called the Invention Secrecy Act, which I think is fascinating. In 1951, they passed this law, and it basically stipulated that anyone who filed a patent for a new invention had to subject the idea to national security review by the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, and NASA. So any invention that, in the judgment of these organizations and whatever criteria they were using, could be declared a national security risk and basically suppressed or sequestered by the government. And this continues today. This is a fairly common thing for the government to do to new patent inventions. The censorship sort of began to expand out of the original area of nuclear energy into many other areas of science. And of course, we all know that UFOs have been subject to a lot of interest by the intelligence community. We know about the CIA's Robertson panel, which ordered the debunking of UFOs in 1953. And so, you know, things really began to kind of mushroom out of control. Now, where the Robertson panel recommended that, you know, they were really trying to suppress news coverage of UFOs. And the CIA's version of events is that, well, they thought about it, but they never really did anything. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that they, in fact, did follow through on this program. And one was kind of an interesting conversation reported by Coral Lorenzen in 1953, or actually in a book published after 1953. But she had a conversation with J. Allen Hynek and Lieutenant Robert Olson, Air Technical Intelligence Command representative. And she says that Olson told her, we, meaning the U.S. government, presumably, are going to try to keep UFO reports out of the newspapers. So, again, you see evidence that even among the relatively low-level intelligence personnel, the word had gone out that censorship of UFO reports was underway. There were a lot of very high-profile airline pilot reports in the 1950s, and they received very sensational news coverage in newspapers across the country. And this was a big problem for the U.S. government because they didn't know how to deal with these. There was a lot of public concern and interest in the subject. And in 1954, it was reported that pilots were reporting 5 to 10 UFOs per night. That's an amazing number if you think about it. You read the actual stories, they're fascinating to read today in the light of the current media environment, which is much more skeptical. So what the government did about this was that they included UFOs in a document called JNAP 146. And this required commercial airline pilots as well as military pilots to report UFO sightings to the intelligence apparatus. And once they did that, they became a national security matter and could not be disclosed to the press. So the effect of JNAP 146 was to basically sweep all these airline pilot stories from the media. This is a close-up of the document, and you can see right here they've included UFOs in a long list of sensitive intelligence information. Now there was a backlash by the airline pilots. It was reported in a newspaper called the Newark Star-Ledger in December 22nd, 1958. And there were about 50 airline pilots who signed a protest against the Air Force censorship of their sightings. They really didn't like this. They saw it as an abridgment of their constitutional rights and tried to overcome it. But and eventually, I guess there were another 400 pilots that joined the group. So there were 450 pilots that were protesting this censorship, but it really came down to whether they wanted to keep their jobs. And faced with that choice, most people cave, and that's pretty much what the airline pilots did. I want to talk a little bit about wire service censorship, because I think there's quite a lot of evidence that was happening from the 50s onward. We all know about the Roswell case. There was a wire service operator, Lydia Sleppy, is that right? I can't remember her name, but she claims that she tried to transmit a wire service report about the Roswell crash, and she got a call from the FBI telling her, do not transmit. So they were obviously monitoring the wire services for UFO reports. Now, when the University of Colorado UFO study, quote unquote, took place in the 60s, many people thought that this was being stage managed by the CIA, by the intelligence community. And one of those was a reporter named R. Roger Harkins. And Harkins one day was asked to do a story about the University of Colorado study by the Denver AP Bureau. So, in other words, they were asking him to do the story, right? So he thought, well, this is a great opportunity to test whether the intelligence community is in fact stage managing all the press surrounding this event. So he wrote up a story based on an interview with Jim Lorenzen, in which Lorenzen implicated the CIA. He said he gave him a rationale for why the CIA had to be interested in UFOs. And then Harkins went back and he wrote up a story and he filed it on the AP, assuming that if the CIA was monitoring the wire services, they wouldn't let the story out. Well, sure enough, the story never appeared on the wire, even though the AP had requested it. So there's some kind of interesting information there about suggesting that wire service suppression of UFO stories was happening. And of course, we're all familiar with many other very high-profile UFO sightings that have happened not only in this country but around the world that just vanished from the wire services and are never mentioned by any of the major U.S. news media. And a contrary example, I think, is what I call the internet effect. Steve Bassett talked about this earlier, that the internet has kind of broken the embargo on this subject, and that you can now go around the wire services and around the major media and get stories out via the internet, so they show up, whereas before they just wouldn't have appeared at all. Okay, I'm going to switch to the subject of propaganda. If you've ever seen the movie The Wizard of Oz, you probably remember that little dog Toto here pulls aside the curtain and reveals the Wizard of Oz standing behind the curtain there, manipulating the controls and making the great Oz do his thing. Well, that's kind of really a good metaphor for what propaganda is all about. And as with censorship, there are a broad range of methods of getting propaganda into the media and into the public in general. Cover stories are a good way of spinning things. There's damage control or spin control is sort of a variation. Bogus investigations, we've all seen a lot of that in the UFO field with the Roswell, or the various Roswell reports that have changed over time, the University of Colorado study, and on and on. Recruitment of influential people as spokespersons. We've seen people like Carl Sagan come out strongly against UFOs, trying to give the impression that scientists don't believe in them. In fact, many of them do. Use of group leaders to influence lower-ranking members, front organizations, targeting of selected influential groups, psychological tricks. I'll give an example of that shortly. Rumors and misleading information, disinformation, use of agents, often reporters working undercover as intelligence operatives to spread propaganda. Films and TV programs, I'll talk about that a bit, and books and articles written under contract. That's a very, very common way of disseminating propaganda. Okay, well, I mentioned before that there was this thing called the Robertson Panel. I think most people who are familiar with the history of the UFO story know about that. They wanted to debunk UFOs and try to get them out of the newspapers. Now, not many people know who Robertson was. However, he was not just a public relations hack who was assigned this job of managing media news. He was a very high-level intelligence officer and a leading physicist. This is a photograph Robertson on the end here in the company of Einstein and Oppenheimer and other leading lights of the physics world. And if you studied astronomy, you probably know about something called the Poynting-Robertson effect, which explains how sunlight clears the solar system of interstellar dust. That was Robertson's work, partly. Now, Robertson not only was a very top scientist, but he had been, during World War II, the principal liaison between U.S. and British scientific intelligence. And he became very good friends with this gentleman, Dr. R.V. Jones. Reginald Victor Jones is his full name. And Jones was one of Britain's leading experts in scientific intelligence and the use of deception planning. And he was very active in the use of deception long after World War II. He attended CIA conferences on the subject. He was a real mover and shaker. And there's evidence that Jones played a very important role in setting up the Robertson panel and the Condon Commission, which I think is significant. So you see all these really top-level scientific intelligence people involved in manipulating public perceptions of the UFO topic. I think that strongly suggests that the UFO subject was a much higher priority for the U.S. and British governments than they tried to make us believe. This is a very interesting letter. It was discovered by Michael Swords in the archives of the Smithsonian Institution. In 1966, there was a lot of UFO activity across the United States, and CBS News jumped into the fray and put on a broadcast on CBS Reports documentary series called UFOs, Friend, Foe, or Fantasy. And the gist of the program was, surprise, surprise, UFOs are just mistaken identity, there's nothing going on, don't worry about it. Well, this letter here from Thornton Page, who was a Robertson panel member, basically confesses that that CBS program was a product of the Robertson panel's efforts to debunk UFOs. So you can see here very good documentary evidence that CBS News was basically lying to the American public on behalf of the CIA about UFOs. I've always been curious to know whether Walter Cronkite knew that this was a CIA operation. I tried to contact him through CBS News, but wasn't able to do so. But it's hard for me to believe that he was that badly informed that he could believe what he was telling the American public in that program, because it was pretty deceptive information. Now, I think there's a lot of indirect evidence for the New York Times cooperating with the Robertson panel. I don't have the kind of documentary evidence that I just showed you for CBS, but there's a lot of interesting things about the New York Times if you followed its coverage of this subject. Well, we know, first of all, that the CIA wanted to suppress UFO news coverage, right? This Robertson panel said so. Now, to do that would require cooperation of leading news services such as UPI, AP, New York Times Service, and so on. Number three, we know that Arthur Sulzberger's policy was reportedly to help the CIA whenever possible. In other words, he was very cooperative with the CIA on many different issues. Now, there was an interesting study by a Berry College group of academics looking at how the New York Times reported the UFO subject over time from the Robertson panel onward, and they found that there was an obvious and documentable increase in anti-UFO reporting in the New York Times from the Robertson panel onward. Another thing about the New York Times is I find frustrating and mystifying is they have what I call chronic institutional amnesia about UFOs. The editors there don't seem to recall even basic historical facts about UFOs, even when they've been published in the New York Times itself. Now, both CBS and New York Times, remember, were supportive of Hynek's bogus swamp gas story, which almost the entire national media laughed at the time. So it's sort of odd that New York Times and CBS would get behind a story like that. It's suggestive that there's perhaps some cooperation going on. And there's an unwillingness at the New York Times to check facts about UFOs. Probably know about that. And there's an unwillingness to report, or to correct errors, and a willingness to report CIA's false claims about UFOs. You probably remember this story that was published in the Times a few years back about most of the UFOs in the 50s and 60s being generated by spy planes and so on. Well, Mark Roediger at the Center for UFO Studies actually talked to one of the members of the Project Blue Book and asked him whether that was true, and he said, no, it's ridiculous. We never received a single report that could have been attributed to a spy plane. So there was no truth to this story whatsoever, according to the people within Blue Book, and yet the New York Times just published it as an absolute fact. So, and of course we know that historically the New York Times has been very cooperative with the CIA for quote-unquote national security reasons. So that's about as good as I can do at the moment. Now, this is kind of interesting. This is a story from the New York Times, December 16th, 1954, where Eisenhower makes a public statement denying that the world is being invaded by flying saucers. And this story was published on the front page of the New York Times, and then of course it goes on to kind of poke fun at the whole subject and indulge in the standard debunking line that has become so familiar to us all. We're all familiar with the the Roswell disinformation. I'm not sure how I'm doing for time here, by the way, so somebody may want to give me a clue if I'm running over. But we all know that the Roswell story, as the government tells it, has changed over time, depending on what facts have been available to the public. They keep reforming the story and reshaping it in order to conform with the information that's out there. The most ludicrous aspect was this inclusion of the crash test dummies in the story, which is, everybody got a big laugh about. Ryan Wood, last year, I think, or in one of the previous talks, gave some examples of what appears to be disinformation showing up in newspapers around the country related to alleged UFO crashes, where stories appear in variations of the original story with a lot of the names changed, apparently to mislead people who might try to investigate the story further. This is a story that I wrote a lot about in my book, but as you may be aware, in the 60s and 70s there were huge numbers of UFOs reported over the missile silos in Montana and other places across the U.S. And this story was well reported by the regional newspapers. There were many, many stories about this phenomenon, but they never seemed to attract any attention from the national media. Major story happening right under their noses, and they're just not interested. But 2 years after it started happening, the story finally appeared in, of all places, the National Enquirer. Well, if you know how the National Enquirer is perceived by particularly intellectuals in the U.S., you'll know that if they saw a headline like this, they would just kind of blow it off. But in fact, this story is entirely true. All these things really did happen, and a lot more than that happened. And again, the mainstream media were silent about it at the time. Eventually, some of these things did start to surface in places like the New York Times and the Washington Post, but it was about 4 years after the story actually occurred. Napoleon is supposed to have said, it's not always necessary to censor the news as long as you can delay its arrival to the point where it's no longer considered news. And you see a lot of that in the way this story is handled. Now, the National Enquirer has a very interesting history, and I think it's worth reviewing that a little bit in detail. The National Enquirer grew out of a publishing family, the Pope family in New York. There was an Italian language newspaper they published called Il Progresso, and in World War II, the editor of Il Progresso was supportive of Mussolini, and this kind of raised some red flags in the U.S. intelligence community, so they infiltrated a couple of OSS agents into Il Progresso to find out what was happening. They ultimately concluded that Pope was not really so much a fascist, but really just wanted better relations between Italy and the U.S. But that was the first time that the intelligence community and the Pope family came together. Now, in 1946, Gene Pope Sr.'s son, Gene Pope Jr., he graduates from MIT at age 19 in engineering. So this is evidence that the kid was very, very bright to get an engineering degree at 19 from MIT. Gene Pope Sr. died in 1950, and there was kind of an internal family struggle over the control of Il Progresso. And for reasons I'm not really clear about, Pope Jr. lost out in this struggle, and he got another job in, of all places, the CIA's psychological warfare unit. He said that himself. So now, 1952, Gene Pope Jr., he's now 25 years old. He leaves the CIA's psychological warfare unit, and he purchases the New York Enquirer from the Hearst chain, and he later renames it the National Enquirer. And he purchased it for $75,000. Doesn't sound like a lot of money today, but in those days it was quite a big chunk of cash for a 25-year-old kid. And he described this as being an interest-free loan. He was never very specific about where that money came from, and there's been a lot of speculation. Some people have attributed it to Frank Costello. Pope denied that vigorously and said the mob never had anything to do with funding the National Enquirer. It took quite a bit more extra funding to get the Enquirer up to speed and make it a profitable paper. I think the total amount in 2003 dollars was about $1.6 million when you correct it for inflation. And now one of the first employees of the Enquirer was Bill Bates, who was a former OSS officer. So again, you see these ties between the intelligence community and the Enquirer. In the 1950s, the CIA is spending very lavishly on a variety of media assets, as they called it. And of course, in 1953, as I mentioned, there's the Robertson panel, which wants to debunk, ridicule UFOs. So the next thing that's interesting is that the National Enquirer takes a strong interest in the UFO topic, and in the 60s and 70s particularly establishes a reputation for very sensational UFO-related news coverage. It's about the only national newspaper in the U.S. that pays consistent attention to the UFO topic, but they mix it in with a lot of trashy stories about tabloid topics and celebrities and things like that. So, you know, it sort of sets a pattern for casting the subject into disrepute. So is that just an accident, or was that part of the plan? Well, there's no way to know for sure, but when in the 1970s, when Pope was trying to get the Enquirer into the Winn-Dixie grocery store chain, he got some support from an unusual source, and that was Melvin Laird, Nixon's Secretary of Defense, who helped. What he did was he invited a bunch of Winn-Dixie executives on a tour of the White House, and the executives were so impressed with Pope's high connections to the White House that they agreed to distribute his paper. And a Forbes reporter asked him about this, and he said, how is it that you have these high-level ties with the White House? And Pope responded sort of mysteriously. He said, well, it's politics. One hand washes the other. So I think what he's saying there, in my interpretation, is that he was doing a favor for the Nixon White House or the Pentagon, and then in return they were helping him out. So what was that favor? Well, since he came out of the CIA's psychological warfare department, I think it's reasonable to suggest that the National Enquirer was being used as a psychological warfare device to put a negative spin or a debunking spin on the UFO topic, which is exactly what the CIA was trying to do. Now, again, when Pope died in 1988, the person who gave his eulogy at his funeral was Defense Secretary, or former Defense Secretary by that time, Melvin Laird. So there you have it. And I think, a lot of people have said, well, that seems like a lot of trouble for the CIA to go to just to debunk UFOs. But if UFOs were a major national security problem, which I think they were, I don't think it's really all that much trouble at all. In fact, there are other examples of the CIA using this tabloid trick to debunk other political movements. Apparently, John Kenneth Galbraith discovered a newspaper like the National Enquirer when he went to India to serve as ambassador under John Kennedy. So this was something that the CIA's little cookbook of tricks was being used for in other parts of the world. Let's see. Okay, well, I already talked about this. This was the story about the CIA wire service collusion, so I just wanted to reemphasize that there are these ties between the wire services and the national security establishment. Okay, well, let's put all these pieces together for a minute and think about propaganda. What you really are trying to do with propaganda is create a false picture. Remember, you've already eliminated factual information about what's going on. So the public doesn't really know what's happening. So what you do then is you try to create a false picture of what's happening by sprinkling little bits of information in 1,000 different places through all the different media organizations to create this idea that UFOs are nonsense, they're seen by crazy people, on and on. You know the story. And I've already shown you evidence that CBS was involved in this. There's strong circumstantial evidence that the New York Times was doing the same thing. Wire services we know are tied in with the CIA, and they tend not to report UFO stories. National Enquirer, I talked about that. So if you sort of see, you got the Robertson panel here feeding into the Wisner's Wurlitzer, which is the CIA's propaganda apparatus, and then out through all the various news media outlets. Now there's another way that there are other high-tech ways that you can suppress or override the media or insert propaganda, and one is this kind of interesting psychological warfare aircraft. It's called Commando Solo, and this airplane is capable of flying over an area. Let's say a UFO crash happens and it's getting broadcast on the local news radio stations and so forth. Well, what this airplane can do is fly in, overpower the local broadcasters, and insert completely different programming right over the top of all those other broadcasts. Okay, well, so let me just kind of summarize this in the context of a UFO crash. Suppose there's a UFO crash. The first thing that the government or the military authorities would want to do is detect it before everyone else. And of course, they're well positioned to do that because they have a very extensive array of intelligence gathering resources, radar networks, echelon, satellite surveillance, and all this. So the likelihood is that they would get there first. They would know about it before almost everyone else in the world knew about it. And the next step would be to impose media censorship via all the methods that I just described. Third step is to create a pseudo-environment, cover story or whatever, however you want to explain it away, using all the standard tricks. And then sort of mop up any loose ends and reinforce the official story through regular denials and deceptions. So I think that's kind of basically how they do things. Now let's just consider the whole idea of a UFO crash. The world is a small place today. We think of it as a small place, but if you've ever gone sailing or traveled in many parts of the world, it's a pretty big place still, even today. And the likelihood is, if a UFO crashed at random, that it would wind up in some remote area in the ocean or a desert or something like that. And so the public wouldn't very likely learn about it. But the possibility is that UFO crashes, if they occur, we think they have occurred, they may not be random. They may not just crash at random. They might even be brought down by our military. As I said before, if it's true that there was a lot more UFO activity going on in World War II that the public wasn't told about because there was no free press, the military may have been developing technologies to shoot down UFOs on the side, of course very covertly during World War II, and then at the end of the war maybe they had these available when the UFOs started poking around over Los Alamos and places like that in the desert Southwest. I don't know if that's what really happened, but it may be that these crashes are not random because they occur near military installations in some cases. Now, one of the most extraordinary events of modern history was certainly the detonation of the first atomic bomb in New Mexico at the Trinity site. This was a public event in every sense of the word. I mean, it created a blinding flash of light, an enormous noise. It was seen and heard over a wide area. Many people knew about it, and yet they were able to explain it all away as an ammunition dump that had exploded and not, causing no loss of life. And the press pretty much bought that story. So it shows you how even something as obvious as a nuclear explosion can be explained away and suppressed. So if you can do that, the idea of suppressing knowledge of a UFO crash is probably relatively trivial. Another question people have is, can a small group of people really fool the world about a story this big, a story this important? And to counter that, I always cite this organization in World War II called the London Controlling Section. This was a group of very well-connected and highly talented British intellectuals and military officers who planned all the deception strategies for World War II. It was a very tiny group, and from this tiny group radiated a massive network of intelligence operations that were designed to leave the Germans confused and beaten, and of course that's exactly what happened. So this idea that a small group of people can conspire to fool the entire world is not really a far-fetched idea at all, and it's been done once, probably many times in history. Okay, so what can we learn about this that we can maybe put to use in seeing through media deceptions about UFOs? These are kind of general observations, and they may be helpful or maybe not. One thing is that you have to remember that given enough effort, anyone can be fooled. This is Jack Nicholson in Chinatown. Thinks of himself as a very street smart, savvy kind of guy, blunders into this situation where land is being bought cheap, and you probably know the story, but it just shows you that you have to somehow balance your skepticism and cynicism with an open mind. A lot of things that seem very improbable and that you might laugh off may actually have occurred. So you have to, it's a delicate balance that we have to walk. Now, it's important to remember also that the ties between the media and the government are strongest at the top levels of the media establishment, the big companies, Washington Post, New York Times, CBS, the whole shebang. But as you go down, the publications are less well tied into the intelligence apparatus. So you tend to see UFO reporting in small-town media. And I think if there were a crash, it would most likely be reported locally or regionally, and then probably tried to suppress from there. A UFO event reported by a questionable media source might have some basis in fact. And of course, I talked about the National Enquirer reporting the Montana UFO overflights that actually did occur. I'm not suggesting that necessarily that the aliens are behind Bush, although, if you think about it, if they really wanted to destroy us, what better way than to put George Bush in the White House? But my point here is really that, these tabloids are often used to debunk or poke fun at an idea that may be more important than we know. This, of course, is a picture of Roy Neary in the famous movie Close Encounters. It's very hard to get involved in this subject and overcome this enormous societal pressure that's trying to make you feel you're crazy for believing, something contrary to the official story. And so, we really have to have a lot of personal integrity and strength to see through all the tricks that are being played on us and believe in quote-unquote impossible things. The internet is a very useful research tool. It's being used extensively by many people in the UFO field, and it's a good one, but we should remember that it's not immune to censorship and propaganda. The military began planning for using the internet in censorship and propaganda operations many years ago, and I wouldn't be surprised if this has become quite sophisticated. It's important to follow the international media because the international media are less susceptible to the influence of the U.S. government. Not always completely immune, but probably less susceptible. And you do see a lot more interesting UFO stuff appearing in the national media about UFOs, so that's some useful advice, I think. Now, I use this slide because, so many of us are in this field and we're really kind of like the Lone Ranger or we see ourselves as struggling against this cloud of deception that's imposed on us. And we have to realize we can't do this by ourselves. I don't think the UFO movement is powerful enough. We have to forge alliances with other anti-secrecy groups because secrecy is a problem that's much bigger than the UFO topic. And if we see it that way as something that's threatening to our way of life and our traditional form of government, I think it's helpful in winning some allies to our cause. Okay, I want to just give a few comments about this national security idea we hear a lot about in the media these days. I quote this comment by Kennedy. He says, "In times of clear and present danger, the courts have ruled that even the privileged rights of the First Amendment must yield to the public's need for national security." Well, that kind of reflects how we Americans, many of us, have come to see the world, that we should really kind of do away with our constitutional rights so that we can have national security, whatever that is. I think that's a dangerous idea, and it's become too widely accepted. It's important to ask who defines national security. We all seem to think, or we often think that we know what that term means, national security, right? But who really makes the decisions about what's a national security issue? There's a lot of people that have input to that. It's transnational corporations, oil companies, Wall Street firms, military-industrial complex, wealthy people, organized crime in some cases, the intelligence community certainly, and foreign countries. Britain, as I talked about, and Israel also plays a big role. I think it's very dangerous to have blind faith in this national security establishment because historically those who had this power to define national security have tended to use it to advance narrow commercial interests, not the interests of the American public. This is Alan Dulles, who is a Wall Street lawyer, and you wonder if you're familiar with the history of the CIA, who he was really working for. So which is the greater threat? Terrorists who kill perhaps a few Americans a year, or U.S. government secrecy, which has facilitated the theft, really, of trillions of dollars, undermined our economy and democracy, and prevented us from knowing our actual history. I think if you think about it a while, you realize that this whole thing about terrorism is much overblown and is more of a political device than a real threat. I talked, in some of my other talks, I talk about the reasons why the government probably saw UFOs as a national security threat early on. And basically you can kind of lump them into physical threats and social threats. And I won't go into it in a lot of detail here, but I want to flip this around a little bit and think about, look back at the Earth and human civilization as maybe other people or other beings might see us. We're always thinking in terms of, the threat from others outside, but we never really think about the possibility that maybe we're the problem. And I don't know for sure if that's true, but it's useful to think about this for a little bit. What characteristics do we have as a race? Well, we have an ideology of conquest and exploitation, an appetite for violence, 55 million people killed in World War II. We have a willingness to destroy our own biosphere and climate. We have emerging space travel capability, and at least at the beginning of the late 1940s, we had the ability to harness nuclear energy, and we're developing even more destructive weapons all the time. And of course, we have an exploding population. James Lovelock, who's a biologist, I think, and author, says that the Earth has a bad case of the humans. Well, what if the galaxy gets a bad case of the humans? It's conceivable that there are other intelligences out there that are concerned about what we're doing on this Earth because, we're a pretty crazy race for the most part. So it's useful to think about the problem from that perspective. Now, what would their response be if they see us that way? Well, they might try to quarantine us. They might monitor what we're doing with nuclear weapons. They might have a comprehensive program of behavior modification using cultural and genetic reprogramming. That's an interesting way to see what's happening in the UFO field. I don't know if that's really what's going on, but it might be. So something to think about. Okay, I think I want to end up, or I think this is the end here, talk a little bit about the prospects for achieving a more open, accountable government. I have to say it looks pretty discouraging right now, but I think there are some opportunities, and Steve Bassett already talked about the internet. I think there are a lot of very useful tools becoming available, the World Wide Web. There's something called Tor, which is an anonymous networking technology that's being developed for communicating anonymously so that the public can't spy on what you're doing. And that's a really important area for pushing forward our cause. I won't talk about that too much because Steve really covered that pretty well. And then I think it's possible that, although things look pretty bleak in the United States right now as far as openness and accountability, that there might be some event that triggers so much public outrage at the system that there's a popular uprising for fundamental reform. Well, these are some of the new media opportunities. Linda Howe is doing that with Earth Files, and Ryan is working on his project. There are lots of good examples, and I can't really list them all. The pitfalls of the new media, well, it fragments the mass audience, so it makes it more difficult to reach large numbers of people except by piecemeal fashion. There's easier government surveillance through the internet. It's kind of a two-way channel. There's a high noise level on the internet, so the quality standards tend to be kind of bad. There's these preferred service initiatives, people that are trying to destroy network neutrality. There's greater internet control by the Pentagon. There's government-sponsored disinformation. I think there's a lot of this on Wikipedia, in my personal opinion, having looked at some of the stuff on there. And there's probably a lot less funding for investigative journalism as the big media companies become weaker economically. Now, the event that might catalyze a change is maybe something like this. I don't know if you're aware of this, but a lot of people don't believe the official story about September 11th. And there's some pretty high-caliber intellectuals that are involved in this. If it turns out that this was an inside job that the government designed to, in the manner of Pearl Harbor, to get the public behind the war effort to invade Iraq, it could be could create a lot of public anger at the government, and we might be able to leverage off that for the UFO field. I think Steve kind of intimated about that a little bit. These are some of the polls that show a skeptical public about 9/11. So the point is that people, when they're really motivated, when they're really fired up about something, they do have the power to force change. It can be done. And we shouldn't get too depressed about our current situation under the Bush regime, because things can change pretty quickly if the public is motivated. I'd like to end with this comment by Daniel Ellsberg, which I think is worth thinking about. He says, "The risks of no secrecy are the risks of democracy." And his point is that, it just comes with the territory. Either we're going to have an open society and accept some of the risks of that, or we're going to give it all away and convince ourselves that we live in a safe, secure place, but we have no freedom. So I think we've gone much too far in the direction of the national security state. That's about all I have to say. Thank you very much.